focus in. Usually what I do is run you through just a couple of the highlights of what we're hearing. A lot of times this times out with our email hitting your inbox. I'm just going to let some of the additional participants come in here. We've got about 51 of you on. And then as we get into the Q&A, just a heads up that I'll play it by ear. Usually when we have a lot of people, it's hard to just have you guys raise your hand. It's harder to spot that. But you can unmute yourself. I've had people unmute themselves and then say, hey, can I ask a question? And that's perfectly acceptable because like I said, sometimes it's hard for me to spot that. And then also, again, I'm used to looking at it on my computer. Down at the bottom, it literally looks like a talk bubbles that says chat. So if you're not comfortable unmuting, you can always just type in a question there in the chat. That's also, if something gets mentioned, a website or a resource. We've had some people post resources in there. And so it's just a way to message me. So without further ado, let me share my screen here to bring you up to speed on just a couple of things that we are watching. So I think you can see my computer screen here. Otherwise, Maggie's always good. Maggie from our team is always good about telling me, nope, we're not seeing what you're talking about. So bottom line, here's what I was just on. Oh, sorry, let me explain what I'm looking at. This is the email that you would have received. I'm gonna open up another tab here to give you an idea. So when you go to our website, which is lacrossechamber.com, there's a COVID page. And so you can always get to every email that has been composed here under the daily email. There's a bunch of resources here. We're literally starting to reorganize again because we get so much information that it becomes out of date, and we want to be able to get you quickly to the information that you need. So I literally was just on a webinar with Ron Kind that started at 1:45. And the big thing that he is talking about is obviously it is slow going to get funds from the federal government. He said that's not surprising because essentially of how many applications they are getting. I am quite certain he's aware of potential shortages of funding, and so hence the feds are talking about additional funding coming to businesses in this next round of conversations that they're having. So again, expanding even more money, it's so crazy when we're talking about billions of dollars, right? So $125 billion additional going into paycheck protection, other funding for small businesses, the economic injury disaster loans, some grants in there. And then if you guys saw the news, like Gunderson said, it's losing $1 million a day because it's non-COVID, it's non-essential operations. They furloughed people now to save some dollars, but it's hitting our hospitals hard, as strange as that seems. So we are, of course, highly monitoring the federal stimulus bill and what's going in there. We did, just FYI, we put out a call on Facebook to have people help us. The Chambers of Commerce were not included in the payroll protection program. And so Chambers of Commerce and other membership-driven organizations. And so we're hoping to get included in that. And we sent that out via social media. The Home and Business Association actually gave us a great calculator for the PPP, the payroll loan. And so that is included in this email as well. And everything that we are hearing is just, we're staying in close contact with the financial institutions, the lenders. What we're hearing right now is the focus is on their existing customers, and then they're putting new customers after that. So it's just something to be aware of, but we are hearing, as a call out from my email today, saying, what are you hearing? Are you getting loans? Are they being secured? When do you expect funding? And we're getting a few of them. Some of them are biting their nails. They did apply, haven't heard anything. Another one did get it approved. So we're keeping our ear to the ground on that, because there's no sense of having hope in funding that you can't necessarily get. So just to be super quick, April 13th, which is already this coming Monday, something to be aware of, we have our state elected. So Schilling, Senator Schilling, Jill Billings, Steve Doyle, Representative Steve Doyle will be on at 3 o'clock. As many of you know, there's so much focus on federal funding right now, but we're all kind of staring at the state going, what's coming from the state? And so they'll be able to give an update at our forum on Monday. So I'm not going to run you through all this. Just know that this is in your inbox. There's a loud voice coming from sole proprietors, independent contractors. That's what I'm seeing as the biggest gap out there. And obviously there's a few more things down here. I fixed the link to the Inc. article. So if you do come to the website here, you will get the updated Inc. article, which is them talking about what they're hearing from SBA. Apparently I've heard it in two places, $1,000 cap per employee on the $10,000 advance, which is the quick grant, if you will. So that's something that we're monitoring. We're getting conflicting information, but we wanted to make you aware of it nonetheless. So without further ado, you all did not come to hear me run through an email that's sitting in your inbox. So I wanted to welcome Kara Burgos, who is with Moen, Sheehan, Meyer, because obviously many of us are in new territory with employees and how we handle illness in our midst. And so Kara graciously agreed to come on and talk about some of the frequently asked questions and some of the questions we received. So Kara, take it away. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Vicki. Good afternoon, everyone. The Chamber had forwarded to me questions that have come through their website. So I'm going to start with addressing some of those. Maybe they're the same questions that many of you have. At the end, once we're gone through those, if there's others, you can pop in and ask those. If we get through to today and you guys still have more questions, you can send them through to the Chamber and I'll try to get those answered the best I can. I do want to point out that there's a lot of information out there on the internet, and some obviously has opinion pieces, but really if you're looking for an answer, there are great websites through the DOL, the Federal Department of Labor website, the state DWD website, or the DHS website. They're kept fairly up to date and they have a host of really good Q&A. So if you're looking for something that you can kind of zero in on and narrow, I would encourage you to look through those websites when you have a question. So one of the first questions that had come up was in regards to taking an employee's temperature. Now, normally this would not be something that people could do because it would be considered an overly broad medical exam under the ADA and therefore not job related necessarily. But as of March 19th, the EEOC has issued guidance that specifically stated that when the pandemic has become more severe than the flu in the community that you're living in, as assessed by state or local health authorities or the CDC, then employers may measure employees' body temperature. So that in fact has occurred. So you are permitted to in fact take an employee's temperature. Now, obviously we know, given the health information available, that people who have COVID-19 aren't necessarily those with the fever. Some people are asymptomatic, so we don't want to get into reliance on just that factor alone. So you should also continue with the other guidance that has been issued, such as questionnaires, to look at other symptoms that might be in place. So in addition to a temperature check, you might ask, what other symptoms are people experiencing? And it's also important to not only do that for your employees, but people that are coming into your facilities as well, because you should make this across the board. If you're going to institute a temperature check, do it for all employees, all staff, anybody that's entering that building. And again, continue with the guidelines that the CDC has put out, continued hand washing, continued non-essential travel, things of that nature. In regards to taking the temperature, that's something that there was also a question regarding how we keep records of that and what we do with that. So if you are taking temperature checks, you need to keep that information separate from standard employment files. That needs to be kept so that it's not being used for any other disclosures down the road. If somebody were to request a personnel file for litigation or a personal injury matter down the road, those temperature checks should not be included in release of that personal record. So they should be kept separately as a COVID-19 issue and distinct from other employee personnel file records. This is federal guidance that I'm talking about, but also the DWD has said that the temperature can also be taken in the state of Wisconsin. So if you're going to set that up, it should be done obviously with accommodations made to keep it private, confidential, so that there's nobody taken out of space to give others in the area, panic that this person is being, so it should be across the board, either first thing in the morning, lunchtime shift, however you want to do it, but it should be across the board for everybody and not lead you to have a discrimination claim down the road that it was done for a certain department or for a certain group of people. It should just be across the board. But again, remember that not every, fevers are just one of the symptoms and not everybody is carrying that. So that's important that, if you're going to do it, it's fine to do it, but also keep in mind that it's not going to be the be all and end all of what you might want to discover if that person does have COVID. Next, one of the big questions was brought up about force majeure. Many of you might see this in, I know we have a large group of manufacturing members of the chamber. Force majeure is a contract provision that excuses a party's non-performance when acts of God or other extraordinary events prevent a party from fulfilling its contractual obligations. But because it's a contract based, you have to have that wording within your contract. So these contracts are generally large contracts that are going to specifically define the terms, such as force majeure includes. In this particular case, it would have to include the language pandemic. WHO has declared it a international pandemic now, so that would fit if you have that language. But if you don't have the force majeure clause, if you don't have the clause, you can't use it. And then if the clause is not defined to include pandemic, it's not going to be of an aid to you. There's also the possibility, though, that force majeure could be included to say and include governmental orders or regulations regarding closures or whatnot. So you have, two possibilities that you can invoke that clause. It would either be a government order or regulation, or something that defines force majeure as to include a pandemic. Unfortunately, that doesn't end the question, because not only do you have to have that contract language, but there are other factors that the court is going to look at. And they're going to look at whether or not you can mitigate the inability to complete the contract. Maybe perhaps it might just be 2 or 3 weeks later, but you can still fulfill that contractual obligation. Or is it absolutely impossible for you to fulfill that obligation because now you don't have workers, or some other factor due to the government regulations or the pandemics as a whole, you're not able to complete that performance. But so the courts are going to look at those different factors, not just whether or not it's a pandemic, or not just whether or not the government has said that put in certain restrictions regarding the movement of goods or services or people. It's also something that you might want to look at in terms of your business functioning, is whether or not you have business interruption insurance. I know a lot of businesses don't necessarily carry that type of coverage because it is fairly expensive. And oftentimes it might apply to physical property damage, However, it's worth a shot. You can call your insurance agent, get a copy of your policy, and you can review the policy to determine whether or not you have business interruption that would apply to this particular case. Now, oftentimes, as a lawyer, I can rely on cases that have gone before and discuss this. Right now, we don't have anything. If you ask me this a year from now, I'd probably have a better answer. But right now, nothing has made its way kind of up the ladder that we have to rely on. But it's worth a shot at this point. As Vicki said, the loans aren't quite going through yet. Everybody's waiting to see what they can get. You might as well try this avenue and see if you have it, and then if it would be applicable. Obviously, insurance companies are going to try to mitigate their losses as well, and they may say right out the box, no, it's not. You don't have to necessarily take the first answer. Do your own research and looking at the policy to see if perhaps maybe it does apply. It would be worth it for that. So another question that had come in was, do employers have to pay employees their same hourly rate or salary if they're working at home? Obviously, many of us who are deemed either non-essential or partly are working remotely as we can. There are two categories that have to be looked at when you're determining that. For non-exempt employees, which are those employees for whom overtime would apply, so that would be all of your hourly workers, they can implement a reduction, not retrospectively, but prospectively, a reduction in wages and hours, as long as that is kept above the minimum wages. So if you don't have enough work for your staff and you have to reduce the hours as they're working at home, that's okay going forward, or from whatever date you set it going forward, as long as they're kept above the minimum wage. But they have to be like across the board. You can't decide one would be this and one would be that if they're all doing the same type of work. For exempt employees, and those would be your salaried employees, they are generally not permissible. If they work any part of a week, you cannot cut their salary. These employees must be paid the same minimum weekly salary for any work week in which they perform work. So that's important to remember, regardless of the number of hours worked. Now, there are some exceptions where these exempt employees, the salaried employees, can have a reduction in their salary and working hours due to something like this. However, the cases that we have seen in the past have generally been for like a 2-month period of time where we're in the same position. Right now will be, our order goes in to about the end of April. That would be a little over a month. Depending upon what happens in May, you might be able to look at that and determine whether or not salaried workers can, whether they can have their salaries reduced. However, even with that, there's still a requirement that they be paid for at $684 a week based on no matter what the hours that they work. You also have to be very careful with most of our salaried workers. They tend to be persons who are on a contract. If you have a contract for a set specific period of time, you need to ensure that you're not breaking that contract, that there's no provision in there to alter the hours or the salary based on something like what we just talked about in the force majeure clauses. So that you need to be careful with those particular contract persons that already bind you to maintaining a certain level of salary, absent anything that happens along the way. Another question was whether or not OSHA regulations apply in a home office, or whether there are other federal laws that employers need to worry about. OSHA is not applicable to home offices. OSHA would never conduct a home inspection of any employees' home offices. An employer has to be careful, however, that they have instructed their own employee with regards to any materials that they're having them work on in their home. I doubt for most of us, most manufacturers are considered essential employees, so they're working in their facilities and factories. So I don't think that there's too much equipment coming home, but certainly different computers, printers, monitors, things like that, they may cause a potential safety hazard and whatnot. So that would be normal. If something happened and someone were injured, normal workers' comp principles would apply. They were engaged in work, and they would be covered under workers' compensation principles. Another question had to do, and this was an interesting question and a very good question. What do employers need to know if they bring on temporary employees to supplement their workforce? The EEOC has confirmed that you can screen applicants for COVID after you make a conditional job offer, as long as you do so for all persons coming in. So if you are hiring 5 people and you have a potential thought that there might be one person, you can't just do the one person. You have to go across the board and have screening all of those persons. Now, whether it's going to be those temperature checks we talked about, or whether it's going to be a screening questionnaire, what symptoms have you exhibited? Where have you traveled? Have you been in contact with anybody who have these symptoms? Those are all the types of screening questions. You can also take the temperature as part of a post-offer pre-employment medical exam, even after you've made that conditional offer of employment. You can also delay a start date of an applicant who has symptoms or is showing symptoms. Obviously, the CDC doesn't want anybody in the workplace who is exhibiting any type of symptoms, so you can delay that start date. And you are permitted, the EEOC has said, to withdraw that offer of employment if the person is showing symptoms and cannot start when you need, because your whole purpose in hiring temporary employees was to fulfill your workforce needs. And if that person is unable to start when you need them to, you're permitted to withdraw that offer of employment based on those showings of the COVID-19 symptoms. So I think so far I got through the questions that were sent my way earlier. I don't know, Vicki, if there's others kind of out there.
I'm unmuting. I do that all the time the first time around. I'm so intent on listening, I forget my mute's on. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat area, so people can certainly interject or unmute. I wanted to go back to your comment, though, Kara, about the equipment in a home. Mm-hmm. So let me make sure I get this straight. So if you tell someone you're going to work from home, here's your computer, here's your printer, and that person chooses, I'm going to be extreme here in my example. They put the printer in the middle of their hallway and somebody trips over it. Like, where is that? How can you control that as an employer to prevent workers' comp claims?
Well, in that particular case, that's not going to involve workers' comp, because you indicated that somebody else was injured. So if someone else was injured, the likelihood is that that person will, if it's a family member, they're not going to have a claim against anybody. Sure. Because the homeowner's insurance will exclude the people living in the house. There's the potential that they would try to indicate or say that because of this, their employer required them to remote from home. The item, the equipment had to be there. It would be very hard pressed for a court or a jury to find that that employer would have directed the placing of that piece of equipment where in your scenario. But with what you said, that brings up a good point. It would be wise for people to, employers, whether it be HR or IT, to have maybe a quick little sheet that goes with any equipment leaving the office to be set up at home, saying, ensure that all cords are kept safely tucked away so that they can't be grabbed by pets or children. Ensure that your workplace remains free of other interruptions, i.e. pets and children. We're all working at home with with those. And so if you have that, at least you've provided your employee with a little bit of direction, and could remove some of that potential liability. I'm not saying that there's not somebody out there that would have and bring some sort of claim to say, this is the fault of the employer. But like in your particular case, I can tell you that that wouldn't go over very well given the scenario you laid out. But again, I think it would be wise to just encourage kind of even just a 4 or 5 point, say you are responsible for, keeping this equipment in a safe location with access only by yourself, i.e. employee, and not other persons, to keep all cables, wires, etc., out of the main traveled areas so that there are no other hazards, so something like that I think would go a long way towards protecting. But if an employee themselves tripped over a cord that was in a fairly well set up area, there would be the potential for workers' compensation claim at that point.
Okay. There's a question here because of the area that we live in, right? So there could be, someone's home could be in Minnesota. So the question is, if an employee lives in a different, okay, I'm just going to read this. If an employee lives in a different tax locality than is normal, this is a taxation issue, and is now working from home, does the employer need to be registered for and report the taxes for the new location?
I don't know the direct answer to that. I don't do tax law. So I don't know the answer to that.
How about this? I can post in the chat what your email is, and then anybody that has questions that didn't get answered, can they just email you?
Sure.
What is it, Kara?
It's KBURGOS as in Sam.
Yep.
At M as in Mary, S as in Sam, M as in Mary, -law.com.
Okay, it's in the chat there. So Tony, if you want to email her, go right ahead. Here's another question. Can an employee refuse to work in a patient contact area / screening area of suspected infected persons? Can they refuse to work based off of being high risk and still get unemployment? So this is a common one. This one's pretty specific of it's a screening area, but I have heard of employers saying, I have a person in this position who just does not want to work. What are the options for an employer?
So with that, they could either see if they could reassign them to an area where there would be less contact with any individuals who may exhibit symptoms. They could, because we're already after the April 1st date of whether or not, and depending upon how many employers that they have, if they're, over that 50 and under that 500 number, 50 being, small employers were able to opt out of the Families First Response Act, and 500 it doesn't apply to. If they do not wish to work, they could potentially be subject to receiving, that's a difficult one because they're not exhibiting their own symptoms. I think an employer should attempt to accommodate them in the best way possible to indicate to either reassign them to an area where they would feel comfortable or allow them to remote from home. If they choose, they're exhibiting no symptoms, and they're not caring for anybody, and there's nobody, there's no other reason why they would not be working, then I think that they would choose to voluntarily leave the employment of the employer. But I would make every effort as an employer to provide them work in a safe environment, almost as if you're it's not COVID is not a disability under the ADA, nor is the potential for, nor is somebody who's high risk. But given these uncertain times, again, like I said before, we don't have any guidance in terms of the court said this is, was upheld or this wasn't upheld. So it's better to be safer and be more accommodating. But if despite any of those accommodations, the employee still refuses and they don't have any symptoms, they're not caring for anybody, they are taking a voluntary departure from their employer at that point.
Related to that screening area, so again, if people are choosing to do uniform to everyone, temperature checks, is there any requirement, or can employees reasonably request, hey, I want gloves, I want a face shield? Like what should employers be thinking about in terms of those screening areas?
I think that all of the above should be put in place. I think that if they're going to be doing those temperature checks, they should have all employees coming into and funneling into either one or two doors. So you either have a temperature check at this one, door A and door B, or just door A. And I think that there should be an area, everybody shouldn't be congregating in the one area while waiting. So there should be, you know, much like we see at grocery stores right now, there's lines marked off, 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet. So you have your employers waiting on those lines. And then somebody inside should be opening the door. Those people are gloved, bringing an individual in. They don't have to sit on anything, but the individual taking the temperature should be wearing a mask, should be, if a gown is available, they should be wearing a gown, and then they should be wearing gloves. When they're done taking that temperature of that person and marking it, they should be changing their gloves. Depending upon the availability of masks right now, that's going to be a little bit, you know, dependent upon what is available. Obviously, we've all heard everybody should be wearing a mask now. There are different types, you know, of the DIY mask. One of the most recent helpful things that I heard is putting, no matter what kind of DIY mask you have, is putting a paper towel inside of the mask on your side. And then this way, when you eventually are done, and if you don't have an opportunity to clean that mask right away, at least the inside of the mask, which is closest to your face, you can throw out the paper towel until you have a chance to clean, you know, that mask and use another mask. So, but they should be, the employees shouldn't be touching any door. They don't need to sit down. They're standing there for their temperature. There should be one person recording with a pen, and then those gloves come off after that person onto the next person. But that line should be done much like we're seeing at the grocery stores now in those areas.
And for those of you, I know we've had people pop into this webinar here. What Kara was saying is that you want to do it uniformly. So you can't say you don't look well and select that person. You have to do it uniformly. We do have a question here from Eve. Can we require a letter from the employee claiming to need self-quarantine or care for a household person for documentation purposes?
Yes, I actually had another employer ask me that today. Yes, you can do that. Or a negative test, you can ask for either or both. So if someone has said that they have symptoms, you've asked them to get a test, you can get proof of that negative test for them to return back.
Okay, and then a follow-up to that. If we have proof, so we being the employer have proof that someone is lying in regards to the above, what would the next step be? So I'm assuming, and Eve, you're really good about unmuting if you're able to. So I'm assuming, Eve, that someone has said, I need to go self-quarantine, and you're saying, I don't believe that they have to. Is that what you're asking, Eve?
Correct. So someone says, oh, I called, they don't want to test me, but I have symptoms, so I'm going to they told me to self-quarantine. I asked them, okay, great. And then I see on their Facebook page that, you know, they're sitting there with a bunch of friends drinking beer.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Eve.
Hi.
Unfortunately, that still fits the parameters of showing signs and or symptoms and or, you know, we can't unfortunately give lie detector tests to everyone. And so the CDC has put out these guidelines that if you are exhibiting any symptoms, and we know the testing is not up to par in terms of the availability of tests for everybody that wants one. So it's difficult to say that that person did not, get turned down for taking that test. So that's a real difficult one to try to prove just based on social media and whatnot, that they are in fact, or may not have symptoms of COVID, especially because some people who are, we know, asymptomatic still carry it. So if someone even has a slight fever that they thought enough to potentially test, it's going to be very difficult to call them on it, even given what you're potentially seeing. So unfortunately, we have to go with what they're saying at that point and self-isolating, based on, essentially, the government has said people that are choosing to self-isolate fit the parameters of, paid sick leave, and yeah.
I'm going to take a question here from Lynn. He asks, are the masks for our protection or for the protection of others? And I know what I've heard, which obviously the masks were originally supposed to be used for people that have symptoms. Now the thought process is changing a little bit. I'm going to morph that into another part of a question, which is, what happens if employees that are at essential businesses start requiring like saying, I'm only going to come into work if you provide me with a mask? So there's two parts to that question.
Sure. I agree with you, Vicki, in terms of kind of how it's morphed. I think it's now both. I think it's, if you have any kind of symptom, you should be staying in and not going out, period, mask or otherwise. But if you are going out, the mask both protects you from any virus that you may be carrying but are asymptomatic, and B, it would prevent you from getting any of the germs that are out there on the particular susceptible parts of our body, our nose and our mouth. So they're both. In terms of if an employee requests a mask, I believe the employer can say, you are permitted to wear a mask here. We don't have any available, but you are permitted to wear one that you feel would adequately address any concerns that you have. So you can't prevent that. But if you are not a business that would normally provide those, you do not now have to provide those. But you cannot discriminate about somebody who would like to wear one.
Got it. And that then, thank you for asking a question, Lynn, because that reminds me of essential service providers who do have to go into a home. So for example, a plumber, right? Something breaks in plumbing, they have to go into a home. What does that look like from a liability, from a protection standpoint? For example, I know if you need a refrigerator or freezer or whatever, an appliance, they're not delivering it into your home, but in some cases they do have to go in. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts in that realm?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I just had a dryer repairman here, and no mask, no gloves, no nothing. And I was kind of a bit shocked by that myself. I think it's up to them, but I don't think it's beyond the pale of a homeowner or a business requesting that. If you have that questionnaire or doing that type of screening that we talked about early on, that you engage that type of screening, temperature check, etc., with that individual. Obviously, in our homes, it's a little bit different, but there's nothing wrong with the homeowner saying, I would ask that you put these gloves on, or if you have a mask that you want to share, whatnot. But the gloves, at the very least, I think that would be an acceptable practice for somebody. And then when they leave, I'm going around with my can of Lysol and I'm wiping down everything that may have been touched.
And so you start to touch on, obviously, essential businesses still have deliveries coming in. And so is there also a requirement that if you're requiring it of one vendor, you have to require it of all vendors?
Yes. just like the same, if you're requiring it of one employee, you required it across the board. So, and I think that gives a little bit of assurances to your employees too, that they see, okay, look, it's not just us, it's anybody that's coming in and out of this building. And, it shouldn't be a big hassle for anybody. It's being done all, across the board. And understandably, they're on time. They got to make this delivery, that, but that's what's going on right now today. And so you can, even if you're going to be doing that, you can also put that out, when you have your salespeople making calls or whatnot, saying, this is our policy. We are going to be implementing this moving forward. Please note your route drivers that this is going to be taking place in the future. If you're starting it next week or whatnot, that can be an easy, you could put a note on the door that says, moving forward, starting on such and such a date, we intend on going through the following screening, temperature check, screening questionnaire,
Yes. This is what I love about webinars is we have people that have plowed pathways that suggest things. So Nancy, thank you. What she says in regard to working in a different state at home, she's pretty sure that the tax base for the employer or employee would stay the same as before they worked from home, unless the employee chooses to permanently work from home, and then the tax base would change. And she's saying that because this just happened to an employee a few years back in her accountant.
That makes sense. I'm sure there are some, temporary for such a thing in the IRS code that would apply to that. It might be, 6 months of the year or something like that. So that sounds about right.
Okay. Eve, I know you raised your hand, but I'm going to get to, Janine before that. If an employee was working at home and now is furloughed, but is now requested to work on site in a clinic setting, excuse me, can a person refuse because of FMLA paperwork on file? So home furloughed, asked to come back and work in a clinic setting. Can they refuse?
And they were furloughed for
a different position. Janine, are you comfortable unmuting? I'm guessing.
Yes.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yes. It is for a different position. It was working at home for appointment coordinator, and it would be working on site in any position.
Okay. And they are requesting that, and you have concerns. Explain to me your concerns.
The FMLA paperwork is for a parent who recently had bypass surgery, and she cares for that patient or that person.
Okay.
And I'm just, and they refuse to come into work because they have that FMLA paperwork on file.
But yet she's applying for this different position?
No, we are asking her to work in a different position than what she was hired for.
I'm sorry, Janine, I'm just still missing your question.
Okay. So if an employee or an employer wanted a person to work who has FMLA paperwork on file, and that employee refuses to work because she cares for her parent who had just recently had heart bypass surgery, can she refuse to go into work based on being on site in a healthcare facility that is treating COVID patients?
Well, I mean, she would be refusing based on the FLMA paperwork already on file. The new restrictions relate to if they have to take leave to care for somebody. The expanded FLMA only applies to children who are now homeschooled essentially and or childcare provider. So her standard paperwork from before COVID still would apply.
Okay. So she'd be okay to be off work.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, Eve, go ahead with your question.
Sorry, I had to go to a quiet place. I'm at work.
Yeah. You have a lot of dogs around you. You have a legitimate excuse, Eve, to have dogs barking.
I've reiterated to all of my mute is my friend. So I kind of reiterated to my staff the social media policy that we have. You know, what happens at work stays at work, because one of my concerns is if one of my staffers gets sick and they start posting about it on Facebook, you know, that people figure out who it is and kind of that thing. So can you talk a little bit about that, Kara, like anything specific we should do to protect ourselves?
I think, Eve, if you have a social media policy already in place, I would do exactly what you said, reiterate that, you know, work information is confidential. They have a right to post whatever they may want in their own personal lives. You can't restrict them, indicating, and they already have, obviously, where they're employed, you know, or who their employer is. But again, I would do exactly what you have done, reiterate that your social media policy in general, that anything related to your business is not to be shared on any social media sites. But unfortunately, there's not much more you can do relative to their ability to indicate, you know, who might their employer be or where they work.
Okay, there's another question. This is related to FMLA again. So if a person has already used up their FMLA or has limited time left, oh, this is a comment, not a question, but there's an I think in there. So I don't think that they can be off once that's completed. Is that correct?
My understanding is the Families First Act has expanded the definition of the FLMA to include if you are caring for a child who is now homeschooled because school has closed or their daycare or care center has closed. So those are the two categories of the expansion, only those two categories. The sick leave had been expanded to include if you're caring for somebody with COVID or et cetera, but the expansion of the FLMA is only for those two categories.
Got it. Okay, any more questions out there? Okay, well, with that, like I was saying, on Monday, we will have our state electeds because we are all waiting for a great update from them as to what the discussions are at the state level. Kara, thank you so very much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. And I may not talk to you all until next week. So have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful Easter weekend, correct? In the meantime, so be well, everybody. And again, thank you so very much, Kara.
Thank you.
Yep, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.